The HOA doesn't allow privacy walls. Cut it down or face the fine.
When Barbara Mitchell reported my hedge to the Homeowners Association, she believed she had found the perfect tool to force me into compliance. She did not know that my landscaping was the only thing preventing her from discovering a serious problem with her own property. The oversight would cost her home, her position, and eventually her freedom. She set these events in motion the moment she decided to target a retired structural engineer with 30 years of experience in foundation integrity and construction law. My name is David Chun. For 8 years, I lived in what I had considered a quiet suburban neighborhood in Oak Valley Estates. After 3 decades designing bridges, high-rises, and critical infrastructure for the Army Corps of Engineers, I had retired to this peaceful cul-de-sac with my wife, Susan, and our 2 golden retrievers. Our corner lot included a mature hedge along the property line, 9 feet tall, well-maintained, and home to at least 3 families of cardinals that returned each spring. I spent my career studying how buildings stand and how they fail. Soil composition, water tables, foundation settlement. These were not abstract concepts to me. They represented the difference between structures that last centuries and disasters in waiting. I had not expected that knowledge to become relevant in my own neighborhood. Barbara Mitchell had moved in next door about 18 months earlier. She was in her mid-50s, impeccably dressed even to check her mailbox, and had introduced herself as the Homeowners Association compliance officer. She delivered the title with the gravity of someone announcing a military rank. Her property was a showcase of rigid precision, hedges trimmed with ruler-straight edges, a lawn with actual stripe patterns, and not a single leaf allowed to rest on her driveway for more than an hour. From the start, she made pointed comments about my approach to yard maintenance. My grass was kept at 3 inches instead of her preferred 2. My hedge had a natural shape instead of being geometrically squared off. Each time she mentioned it, I smiled politely and changed the subject. Barbara was not the type to let things go. The first confrontation occurred on a Tuesday morning in late April. I was trimming some lower branches from the hedge when I heard her voice behind me. She stood at the property line, arms crossed, and informed me that the hedge was a violation. According to her, Oak Valley Estates bylaws clearly stated that boundary vegetation could not exceed 6 feet in height. I explained that I had reviewed the bylaws when I planted the hedge. Section 7.3 permitted natural hedges up to 10 feet on corner lots to provide privacy screening from street traffic. She told me that section had been amended 2 years ago, 6 feet maximum. She had already documented the violation, holding up her phone to show photos she had taken from multiple angles. I pointed out that I had not received any notification about bylaw amendments. The association was required to notify homeowners in writing of any rule changes. She said it had been in the newsletter. I explained that I read every newsletter and there had been no mention of Section 7.3 being amended. I had kept a file of all association communications, a habit from decades of documentation requirements in engineering. Her expression shifted. She told me I had 2 weeks to reduce the hedge to 6 feet, or I would face fines of $100 per day. As she turned to leave, she added that my lawn needed mowing. It looked shabby. My lawn had been mowed 3 days earlier. That weekend, I received the official notice by certified letter. The Homeowners Association cited violation code HG 47 for excessive boundary vegetation height. The letter claimed I had 14 days to comply or face daily fines. It was signed by Barbara in her capacity as compliance officer and countersigned by the association president, Thomas Reed. I spent that Sunday afternoon doing what I did best. I pulled out my original association documentation from when we purchased the house 8 years earlier. Section 7.3 was clear. Corner lot properties could maintain natural hedges up to 10 feet for privacy screening. I then requested all board meeting minutes for the past 3 years through the online portal. There was no record of any vote to amend Section 7.3. No discussion. No homeowner notification. Barbara had simply fabricated it. I also noticed something else in those meeting minutes. 3 separate homeowners had filed complaints in the past year about foundation cracks and drainage issues. All 3 lived on the downhill side of our cul-de-sac. All 3 complaints had been dismissed by the board as cosmetic issues and normal settling. I pulled up the county geographic information system maps and overlaid them with geological survey data I had access to through my professional memberships. Our neighborhood was built on what had once been a hillside. The developer had done significant cut-and-fill work to create level lots. Barbara's property sat on about 8 feet of fill soil, and the county records showed no deep foundation pilings. I grabbed my binoculars and walked to the back corner of my yard where my hedge met the property line. From that angle, if I looked carefully through the gaps in the foliage, I could see Barbara's house. It had a visible lean. Not much, perhaps 2 inches over 30 feet, but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. The siding showed stress cracks near the corners. The attached garage door frame was slightly askew. Her house was sinking. My hedge had been blocking the view that would make it obvious. Monday morning, I received a call from Thomas Reed, the association president. He said he understood I had concerns about the vegetation violation notice. I told him I had concerns about a violation notice citing a bylaw amendment that never happened. Section 7.3 was never amended. He said the board backed Barbara's decision. If I did not comply, they would proceed with fines and, if necessary, legal action to force compliance. I told him I looked forward to seeing him in court and recommended he have the association's attorney review whether the board had liability for enforcing non-existent regulations. The following week, things accelerated. I received a second certified letter, this time claiming additional violations: lawn height, unapproved decorative elements referring to Susan's garden gnome collection, and automotive maintenance nuisance referring to my Mustang restoration in my own garage. Each violation carried a $100 daily fine. The letter stated that if I did not resolve all violations within 7 days, the association would file a lien against my property. I contacted an attorney, Jennifer Carter, someone I had worked with on construction litigation years earlier. She reviewed my documentation and told me they were manufacturing violations. None of it would hold up in court, but they were betting I would either comply or accumulate enough fines to make fighting expensive. I explained what I had observed about Barbara's foundation. Jennifer told me that if her foundation was actually failing, I might have an obligation to report it. That was a public safety issue. I had been thinking the same thing. A foundation failure in a residential structure could endanger lives, particularly if it affected utility lines or caused structural collapse. That weekend, I installed 2 security cameras on my property with clear views of Barbara's house and the property line. I also reached out to Greg Patterson, a former colleague who worked for the county building inspection department. Over coffee, I showed him the geographic information system data and geological surveys. He told me the entire development concerned him. The original permit files showed minimal soil compaction testing for the fill areas. If he had to estimate, at least 4 or 5 houses in that neighborhood were sitting on inadequately compacted fill. I asked what he would need to initiate an inspection. He said an observable structural defect or a credible engineering report raising safety concerns. I also called my former commanding officer from my Corps of Engineers days, Colonel Richard Hayes, who had transitioned to working with the Federal Emergency Management Agency on disaster prevention and building code enforcement. I explained the association conflict and my observations about Barbara's foundation. He told me to send him everything I had: geological surveys, geographic information system data, my observations. He would have one of their engineering assessment teams review it. If there was a genuine safety concern, they would refer it to the state building authority. A week later, I found a formal notice of homeowners association hearing taped to my front door. I was being called before an emergency board meeting on Friday to address ongoing willful violations and failure to comply with correction orders. The notice warned that the board would vote on appropriate enforcement actions, including property liens, legal action, and assessment of accumulated fines. Friday arrived with the emergency board meeting. It was held in Thomas Reed's oversized living room, with 5 board members seated behind a folding table. Barbara sat at the end, her compliance documentation spread before her. About 15 neighbors had shown up. Susan squeezed my hand as we took seats in the front row. Thomas called the meeting to order and asked Barbara to present the compliance report. Barbara stood. She said the property had been in violation for 38 days across multiple categories. She proceeded to list the supposed violations with dates, photos, and her interpretation of the bylaws. None were accurate, but all sounded official. When she finished, Thomas looked at me and asked if I had a response. I stood and pulled out a 3-ring binder I had prepared. I explained that Section 7.3 of the bylaws had never been amended. I had the original covenants, and I had reviewed every board meeting minute for the past 5 years. There was no record of a vote or member notification regarding changes to vegetation height requirements. The violations cited for lawn height and decorative elements had no basis in the bylaws. Automotive maintenance in a private garage was explicitly permitted under Section 9.2 for non-commercial purposes. Barbara had trespassed on my property multiple times to document these supposed violations, which itself violated Section 12's requirement for notice and consent. Thomas said the board stood by Barbara's assessment. I told him then the board was complicit in fraud. I said it calmly, but the word had an effect. The room went silent. I explained they were threatening to place a lien on my property based on fabricated violations. That was fraud, and it exposed every board member to personal liability. Barbara shot to her feet. She demanded to know how I dared. I turned to face her directly. I asked if this was about something she was afraid people might notice if they looked too carefully at her property. I explained she had targeted me with escalating harassment the moment I made it clear I would not cut my hedge. A hedge that happened to block the clearest sight line to her foundation. The room erupted in murmurs. Thomas said that was completely out of line. I proposed that we have an independent structural engineer inspect both properties. Right now, if my property was in violation and hers was structurally sound, I would pay for the inspection and comply with any legitimate violations. But if I was right about her foundation, we had a very different problem. Barbara's hands were shaking. She said this was a witch hunt. I pulled out my phone and opened a photo. I explained this was taken from the public sidewalk in front of her house that morning. I pointed out the stress cracks in her siding, the way her garage door frame had dropped on the left side, the visible lean in her roofline. I held up the phone. Several neighbors moved to see. Barbara's face had gone from pale to red. I told her I had already filed a formal safety complaint with detailed engineering analysis. The county building inspection department would be conducting an inspection within the next 2 weeks. Barbara made her critical mistake at that moment. She shouted that I had no right. She said she would sue me for defamation. She would have my license revoked. She would report me to every agency she could find until I lost everything. Thomas stood, trying to regain control. He said the meeting was over. Everyone needed to calm down. They would table the violation discussion for the time being. Barbara was not finished. She turned to the other board members. She told them that if they did not support her on this, she would make sure everyone knew they had been ignoring foundation complaints for 2 years. She would expose every shortcut the board had taken to avoid spending money on engineering reports. Every complaint she had buried, every inspection she had delayed, every homeowner she had intimidated into dropping issues. She had just confessed to systemic suppression of safety complaints in front of 20 witnesses. One of the other board members, Karen Williams, stood slowly. She asked Barbara what complaints she had buried. Karen explained she had filed a complaint 8 months ago about cracks in her foundation. Barbara had told her it was cosmetic and normal settling. Barbara had said an engineer would be unnecessary and expensive. Karen's basement flooded last month because a foundation crack let groundwater in. She had $15,000 in damage. Another homeowner stood. Barbara had told him the same thing about his garage separation. Then another. Her deck support posts were sinking. Barbara had said it was normal. Thomas asked Barbara if she had been dismissing structural complaints without board approval. I pulled out my tablet and opened a file. I said I had copies of every association meeting minute for the past 3 years. 3 formal complaints about foundation issues. 0 engineering assessments ordered. 0 reports to the county. Barbara signed off on all 3 complaints as cosmetic issues not requiring action. Barbara grabbed her papers, shoving them into her bag. She said she did not have to listen to this. I kept my voice calm. I said she had been covering up foundation failures across this neighborhood, either because she knew her own house was failing and did not want inspections, or because she was afraid of special assessments to fix the problems. Either way, she had put lives at risk. Thomas told Barbara to step down from the compliance officer position effective immediately. She protested, but Thomas said she had just admitted to burying homeowner complaints in front of 20 witnesses. She was done. Barbara moved toward the door, but stopped when she saw the 2 people standing in the entrance. Greg Patterson from the county building department and a uniformed sheriff's deputy. Barbara's bag slipped from her hands. Papers scattered across the floor. Greg held up his identification. He said he was County Building Inspector Gregory Patterson. He had received an emergency safety complaint regarding foundation integrity issues at this address and several others in this development. He needed to speak with the association board and the compliance officer. Barbara tried to recover. She said this was highly irregular. He could not just show up without notice. Greg told her that when they received a credible safety complaint from a licensed structural engineer with 30 years of experience, they could and did respond immediately, particularly when that complaint included geological survey data, geographic information system mapping, and photographic evidence of visible structural failure. He turned to Thomas. He said he was going to need access to all property records, original building permits, soil compaction reports, and foundation inspection certificates for every structure in this development built on fill soil. Barbara said those were confidential association records. He could not just demand them. Greg's tone remained professionally pleasant but firm. He told her this was a safety investigation. He could absolutely subpoena those records, but he preferred cooperation. However, he should inform her that if he found evidence that legitimate safety complaints were dismissed or suppressed, that became a separate issue involving potential criminal negligence. The deputy stepped forward. He told Barbara that Inspector Patterson was conducting an official investigation. Obstruction would be a serious matter. I told Greg I had copies of the last 3 years of association meeting minutes, including 3 dismissed foundation complaints. I was prepared to provide them. Greg said they should start with Barbara's property. My complaint specifically identified visible structural failure indicators at her residence. Barbara said her house was perfectly fine. This was harassment. Greg said then she would not mind a quick visual inspection. He was already heading toward the door. We all followed. The group walked the 30 feet from Thomas's house to Barbara's driveway. In the evening light, with 20 people looking, the problems were unmistakable. The house had a visible rightward lean of at least 2 inches. Stress cracks radiated from every corner. The garage door frame had dropped enough that the door no longer closed flush. The concrete driveway had separated from the foundation by nearly 3 inches. Greg walked the perimeter slowly, taking photos and measurements with a laser level. The deputy stood watching Barbara, who had tears streaming down her face. Greg asked quietly how long she had known. Barbara's voice was barely audible. She said 2 years, maybe 3. He asked if she had not reported it. She said she could not afford the repairs. Her mortgage was underwater. If the house was condemned, she would lose everything. She looked at me with hatred and said if I had just cut the hedge, no one would have noticed. Greg shook his head. He told her this was not about a hedge. This was about a Category 3 foundation failure. Her house was sinking into uncompacted fill at a rate of approximately 1 to 2 inches per year. She was fortunate the gas line had not ruptured. He said this structure needed to be red tagged immediately. It was not safe for occupancy. Barbara's legs buckled. Karen Williams caught her before she fell. The deputy stepped forward. He said he needed to ask her some questions about the complaint suppression. He asked if she had knowingly dismissed structural safety complaints from other homeowners. She did not answer. She sobbed. Greg turned to me. He said he was going to need my full engineering report. Thomas asked Greg how many other houses might have this problem. Greg pulled up a map on his tablet. Based on the geological data I had provided and the original grading plans, he estimated 7 to 9 properties were built on significant fill. They all needed immediate inspection. The deputy called for backup and a crisis counselor. Greg made a series of calls to his supervisor, to the county structural engineering unit, to the state building authority. Within an hour, 3 more inspectors arrived with ground-penetrating radar and laser surveying equipment. By sunset, 4 houses had been red-tagged as unsafe for occupancy, including Barbara's. 5 more were yellow-tagged pending detailed engineering assessment. The county had opened a formal investigation into the original developer's soil compaction practices and the association's response to homeowner complaints. The investigation moved quickly after that. Within 2 weeks, a forensic engineer had confirmed that the original developer had falsified soil compaction reports for the fill areas. The shortcuts had saved an estimated $200,000 in proper grading and foundation work and had created a disaster in waiting. Barbara faced criminal charges for criminal negligence, obstruction of a safety investigation, and fraud related to the false association lien threat. The prosecution argued she had knowingly suppressed safety complaints to hide her own home's failure, endangering multiple families. 3 homeowners testified about being told their legitimate structural concerns were cosmetic and not worth investigating. The board, including Thomas Reed, faced civil liability for failure to act on repeated complaints. Their insurance carriers settled with the affected homeowners for undisclosed amounts. Thomas quietly resigned and moved out of state. Barbara's house was demolished 4 months later. The foundation had deteriorated beyond repair, and the cost to stabilize the structure exceeded the property's value. She had purchased it for $340,000. After the mortgage payoff and demolition costs, she received nothing. She pleaded no contest to negligence and obstruction charges in exchange for a suspended sentence and 3 years probation. She was also required to pay $50,000 in restitution and perform 500 hours of community service. She moved to another state to stay with family. I heard she is working retail and living in a small apartment. I do not take satisfaction in that outcome. The other affected families received engineering remediation. 2 houses needed complete foundation replacement at a cost of over $150,000 each, covered by the settlement. 3 others needed significant structural reinforcement. Karen Williams's house was stabilized and repaired. The association itself underwent complete reorganization. A new board was elected with actual transparency requirements. A licensed property manager was hired to handle compliance issues. Every bylaw was reviewed by an attorney to remove outdated, unenforceable, or fabricated provisions. My hedge remains, still 9 feet tall, still home to 3 families of cardinals. 6 months after everything concluded, I was trimming that hedge again when a car pulled up. A young couple got out and introduced themselves as James and Nicole Torres. They were buying Karen Williams's house. She had told them what happened, about how I had reported the foundation problems. Nicole said they wanted to thank me. Their home inspector found the documentation about the foundation work in the disclosure. Without those repairs, without the engineering certification, they could not have obtained a mortgage. Because I had pushed for the investigation, everything was fixed properly. Karen was able to sell. They were getting a safe home. After they left, Susan came out with lemonade. She said I was considered a neighborhood advocate now. I told her it felt strange. I had just reported a safety problem. That was not heroic. That was basic responsibility. She said I did it when someone with power was trying to silence me, when they threatened our home. That required courage. I thought about Barbara, about her fear and desperation and terrible choices. I thought about how simple it would have been to just cut the hedge, to avoid conflict, to let things continue until something catastrophic happened. I learned something through all of this. Authority without accountability is simply abuse in a smaller form. Barbara had power, the power to issue violations, to threaten fines, to intimidate homeowners, but she faced no accountability for how she wielded it. She used her position to protect herself at others' expense, and she assumed people would be too intimidated or too weary to resist. She was mistaken. I also learned that holding someone accountable does not require cruelty. Barbara lost everything, and while those were consequences she earned through her choices, I do not celebrate her suffering. I value that families are safe, that houses have been repaired, that a flawed system was dismantled and replaced with something more transparent. If you are facing something similar, an association board abusing authority, a neighbor wielding power without legitimacy, any situation where someone is trying to intimidate you into silence, remember this: document everything. Know your rights. Do not hesitate to ask for help from actual authorities. Standing your ground is not always about winning a conflict. Sometimes it is about protecting people who cannot protect themselves. Barbara believed she was fighting to save her home, but she had already lost it the moment the foundation began to fail. All her harassment, all her threats, all her abuse of power, none of it could change the physics of a house sinking into uncompacted fill. She learned that you cannot threaten, intimidate, or bureaucratize your way out of physical reality. Structural problems, whether in buildings or in people, become visible eventually, regardless of how desperately you try to hide them. Sometimes, all it takes is one person refusing to cut their hedge. Thank you for watching this account of accountability, safety, and standing up for what is correct. If you found value in seeing justice delivered and a flawed system corrected, subscribe for more true stories of consequences catching up with those who abuse their power.